Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now, this video is all about the iconic battle, the Battle of Agincourt, 25th of October, 1415. Part of our 100 Years' War series. Now, as you can probably see, I've made a model. But before we can get on to the Battle of Agincourt, you got to find out, how did they get there? So after the Siege of Harfleur, Henry's only left with 900 men-at-arms, that's your knights in armour type of character, and around 5,000 bowmen. That's for his march to Calais. Now don't forget, he's had to send troops home that are sick, he's had to garrison Harfleur, and as well as bury a large number of dead, suffering from that terrible disease, dysentery. Interestingly, Charles VI of France, the king at the time, he was keen to fight the English. However, his mental stability was in question, so they never come down to fight him at Harfleur. There was also another problem. You had the Armagnac and the Burgundian factions of the French army actually hated each other, almost to the point of hostilities. Now, the best French leader they could have had was John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, but he'd have nothing to do with it. There were politics at play here. He stayed away from the whole campaign. So now, Henry V, his march to Calais. I've read that all of his troops were mounted on horseback, and I've also read that some of the bowmen were on foot. So let's just assume it was a mixed bag. They have a march of over 160 miles from Harfleur to Calais. So Henry V's plan was to march from Harfleur to Calais and ford the River Somme at Blanchardtec. He's actually following part of the route that Edward III had taken during his Crécy campaign. Now, the first 3 days of the march, no problems for any of the French, but they've only got this 1 week supply, so they need food, so they need to resupply. And straight away, after that third day, they get problems. Towns are closing their gates, they will not offer supplies. So what Henry does, he says, okay, fine, if you're not going to give us the supplies, we'll burn you to the ground. Supplies are forthcoming. Now, the troops are moving forward, and it was on the 13th of October that they captured a Gascon prisoner. He, obviously terrified to death, and having somewhat been persuaded, I think, and when I say persuaded, he talked. There are 600 troops waiting for you under the Constable of France d'Albret, his command. Blanchardtec is heavily guarded, as are other crossing points over the Somme, and the ford itself now has wooden stakes driven into the riverbed, and they are sharpened. There is no way through. Henry V and his band of men, they've now got a problem. Because of the efforts of the Constable of France d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, the English were contained to the southern side of the River Somme. So many crossings have been blocked or bridges destroyed, and the English might have to march an extra 60 miles, and they were in a terrible state. They were hungry, tired, cold, and of course the dysentery was taking its toll. Come the night of the 16th of October, they'd actually exhausted all of their rations, and the army was very, very low on morale. It really was. But then the king decided something. And this is what makes Henry V somewhat of a brilliant commander. He changes direction completely, marches on Corbie, has a skirmish with the French at a crossing there. Everybody thinks he's going to try and force a crossing at Corbie. But what he does is he marches down. He outpaces the French. He fools them. I reckon he had knowledge of the French plan, because somewhere along here, he orders the bowmen to cut down the wooden stakes, these infamous wooden stakes that you'll see on this most incredible model that I've made. 6 feet, sharpened at both ends. Now they're encumbered with this, but it's important. On the 18th, they arrive at Voyens, where there is a ford. So now the English army gets across the River Somme. A French herald comes down and issues a challenge to Henry V. Come on then, let's do battle. But he says, no, I just want a clear road to Calais. And on he marches. But an interesting fact, from that moment on, Henry V wears his armour and encourages everybody else to do so. Now, on the 20th of October, they pause and have a complete day's rest. They are preparing for battle. With his tiny little English army, Henry V is making his way towards Calais, and on the 21st, near the town of Péronne, the English army crossed the path that the French had taken. The French army had left an enormous track of mud in the ground, and now the English knew that they were indeed going to have to face a mighty French army. Now, on the 23rd, they crossed the river of Tournois at Blangy. They then find out that the French are actually only half a mile away. The next day, the French form up in battle formation in front of the English. So the English, they form their battle ranks, but the French retreat. They fall back on Agincourt. The English follow them. The king, he sets up his quarters in Maisoncelles. He's fine, he's got his quarters, but there's nowhere for his army to really shelter. In the gardens, under the bushes, and it's raining. The French make enormous fires. I do understand they set fire to local houses and all kinds of things. They were trying to illuminate the battlefield to ensure that the English don't slip away in the night. This English army of ours must have been exhausted. They'd marched 260 miles with only one day's rest in 17. Now, before I go on any further, I keep saying English army because pretty much it was. There were around 500 Welsh bowmen within the army, but they were spread throughout the army. They were not just one force. So, a nod to my Welsh heritage. They'd also carried those wooden stakes for the last 8 days. They'd been living on nuts and berries, and just when they got the chance, they fried up a little bit of meat and hastily ate it, ready for the march. These men were in rags. I did read one account which said that some bowmen were actually naked come the day of the battle. Others simply stripped off their nether garments to allow the filth of their bowels to run down their legs. They believed, these Englishmen believed, that they were not going to be victorious. So they confessed their sins, because these men of England and their Welsh cousins believed that upon the morrow they will die. Now, what King Henry V did with his English army the night before the Battle of Agincourt is quite something. You see, the English camp, as they'd first set their fires and goodness knows what, it was pandemonium. There was so much noise, armourers hammering, grooms trying to find bedding for the horses, all these different kind of things. And Henry V turns round and demands absolute silence. Any knight who breaks this rule will lose his horse and harness. That's his armour. He will be disgraced. Any commoner will lose his right ear. So the French are on top of the hill there. They have their camp. They can hear the English when all of a sudden, deathly silence. Now the French camp was ablaze with enormous fires. There was feasting, there was dice playing, and they were playing to see who they could capture. You know, you get all the sixes, you get Henry V. If you get a blank on the dice, it's an archer. He's not worth anything. Just to let you know that the French regarded the English bowmen as nothing, inferior. So the French there with their bonfires and their noise are looking down the hill, but there is silence and no fires. At first they thought the English had drifted away, but it rained all through the night. What the English were doing was huddling under their hedges in the gardens and under the lee of the walls and looking to their bows and their bowstrings, keeping their spare bowstrings under their hats, keeping their kit as dry as they could. And any veteran soldier will know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, one of the habits of King Henry V on campaign was of a night time he'd walk through the camp and he'd chat to his soldiers. So they had become used to this. There's no record that he actually did this on the night before the Battle of Agincourt, but we've got to assume that he did, because the other thing he would do is he would survey. And we do know that Henry sent knights into the battlefield, into the darkness, to survey the lay of the land. He was already planning his battle for the next day. So, as I said, I've made a model. Here it is. I put a lot of effort into this, I will be honest with you, and I'm going to explain I don't have 5,000 bowmen for 2,500 bowmen in one corner, and then right over in the other corner, the other flank of the English, you've got the other 2,500 with 900 men at arms. I don't have 600 French cavalry. I don't have the thousands of foot soldiers. So this is Kevin's representation of the Battle of Agincourt. I've walked that battlefield many times, even once with Bernard Cornwall, the author. If you're watching Bernard, hey, what a great trip we had. So it's ploughed. There's also crops, young corn in it. So I've given some furrows. I'll tell you now, when it's just been ploughed, it's quite tough to walk it. But once somebody else has walked all over, or it rains a little bit, it's a quagmire. So the English, they set themselves up. They have what some people call a hearth. It is a field of stakes. I understand in French, hedge of spikes, or a spike fence against horses, a chef de frise. It's designed so if the French cavalry charge onto it, they will fall on the stakes and the bowmen will shoot away. I've also added a few things. A water cart, arrow supply, and I've got a couple of mounted bowmen coming in a bit late. I've also put in a gun here because just to show that there were cannons there. Now on the French part, there were literally so many men pushing their way into the battle. There was anything up to 20 to 30,000 French troops on the field. The French army was disorganized and there were quarrels. Actually there, on the day, they were arguing who should stand where. The Constable d'Albrecht and Marshal Boucicaut, they managed to get themselves to the front. While all this is going on, Henry V has had no problems. His army is disciplined, it's organised. And we have this great character here, Thomas Erpingham, in charge of the bowmen. He ensures they are in their positions. He ensures that they hammer in their stakes and then go back to their places. But they are half a mile distance from the French. So what happens now after 4 hours of sitting there? Do you know, some of the Frenchmen were relaxed into their saddles, were chomping away. They were having lunch. Many of the horsemen had gone to the rear behind the army, were walking their horses up and down, giving them some exercise. When Henry V pulls his master stroke, he'd spoken to his own advisors. If we sit here, we're going to starve. And that's what we think the French were saying. Just let them starve. Instead, there is a mighty shout. St. George! Now, the shout of St. George was the command for the English army to advance up the hill. But there were two things I'd like to mention here. As that shout went out, St. George! The entire army dropped to its knees and they kissed the soil. And the bowmen took the soil of France into their mouth and made the sign of the cross with the soil on their foreheads. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. They were already dead in their mind. They've got nothing to lose. But before all of this went on, the king, in his most incredibly burnished armour with a crown upon his head, had ridden amongst his men and given a speech of how just his cause was, regaining his rights in France. But he also, so legend has it, gives the speech that the French will cut off your bow fingers if they catch you, so you will never shoot man or horse again. But back to that great shout. So the French are on their horses. They're having a bit of lunch, or they're sat down or in their formations waiting for the English to starve to death. When there is this mighty shout, imagine it, can you? St. George! And then this army of English have up stakes and they're marching towards them. What do? Do you drop your plate? Do you give it to your servant? Do you panic? What's happening? What about the horsemen who are still behind the French army? So there's not going to be 2,000 cavalry of French, because this was the French plan. The cavalry, in 2 divisions of about 1,000 men in each, are supposed to charge down the left flank and the right flank and hit the bowmen, take the bowmen off the battlefield. Meanwhile, the main body of the French, the advance guard, will march forward with the second wave behind them, about 7,000 men in each one. They will march down and plough straight into the English centre. The way the English were formed up, the king was in the centre, Lord Camoys was on the left, and the Duke of York was on the right. So we're all formed, we're all ready, we're all together. Now, also on the battlefield was the king's brother, the Duke of Gloucester. So this is a royal affair. But the French seem to have failed to remember the lessons of Crécy and Poitiers. Watch out for the bowmen. They hadn't scouted the battlefield. On each side of the battlefield, there is a wood, a strong, impenetrable wood to horses that narrows down towards the English. In fact, where the English army are advanced up the battlefield, it narrowed down even more. I've actually read that bowmen were put into the woods on the right flank to shoot into the cavalry as they've come down. But some writers have said, oh, this is dishonourable. Me, I wouldn't care. Get them bowmen in the woods. So, the battle. The English march up that hill. St. George! St. George! The boys in the luggage who supply the arrows from the wagons will have to bring them forward. They will have to push up the battlefield. Between 200 and 300 paces, let's say yards, from the French army, the English army stop. The bowmen reform their ranks. Sir Thomas Erpingham is amongst them, making sure they're hammering in those stakes chest height of a horse, resharpening them. Why didn't the French attack at this moment? The English were vulnerable. The fact is, there was nobody in the French army to give the overall command. Charge! It's as simple as that. Now what happens is the English are ready. That old grey-haired man, Sir Thomas Erpingham, rides up and down, and then he gallops off the battlefield, holding up his marshal's baton, and to one side he shouts, "No streak, now strike!" 5,000 bowmen draw their bows and shoot at extreme range. The French are stung into action. They can either stand there and be butchered by the arrows of England and my cousins of Wales, or they can charge. But there weren't enough of them. There were not 2,000 horse. There was barely 600 horse, and they charged straight down towards the bowmen. I will show you now what happens. 20 to 30,000 French troops on the field. So you imagine now, the charge is coming down this flank, the French left flank, the English right. As they charge down, thousands of arrows are pouring into them. Horses are whinnying, shying away. You, as a knight, keeping your head down. Those who've got visors will close it. Not if you remember my video about what a knight sees through his helmet as the arrows are coming towards him. It must have been horrendous. And then, as they plough into the stakes, the horses will be pierced. Riders will be thrown in amongst the bowmen, who all carry an archer's pick, and will simply stab straight through the face. They will be hacked to death. It must have been absolute carnage here. Now, they can't get through because the chef de frise, all of these stakes, are perfect. So the cavalry has got to wheel past the bowmen who are pouring arrows into the horses. You can see I've actually done some here. And the knights, they've either got to go all the way across the battlefield to escape out of the other flank, or they got to wheel round as tight as they can in front of their own foot soldiers to charge back up the hill through the gap. Meanwhile, their archers still can't bring down any arrows or crossbow bolts on the English because their own army is in the way. And now you have the entire field is churned up. It is deep mud. It's a quagmire. The French army, step by step, are moving forward. Many of them in the front ranks are fully armoured knights and men-at-arms. When their own cavalry, as it wheels round, horses out of control, ploughed straight into them. Many of the knights are knocked to the ground. They have difficulty in getting up. There's still pressure being pushed from behind. I have seen what a horse can do when it jumps into a crowd. It doesn't stop until it's out the other side. This must have been one heck of a shock for the French. So the French recover from the shock of their own horses ploughing through them. They close up the gaps in their ranks and they continue their advance down the battlefield. But the ground has been churned up by the horses. They are wading through mud. Many of those at the front, full armour, they're having a great deal of difficulty just getting towards the English. And on top of that, 2,500 bowmen on the one side are ploughing arrows straight into them. But they're not going to attack the bowmen. The bowmen are beneath them. Not only that, they're behind all of those wooden stakes. They're going to go straight for the men-at-arms, straight for the English fighting man. And on they come, 2 divisions. In the first division, they pick up speed and they plough straight into the English. In the centre of the English line, the line gives a little. That's the only advantage the French had, because the English regain their pace. And what happens is the pressure from behind is pushing. As the bowmen at the side are pouring the arrows in, the men-at-arms at the front are hacking down, and there are bodies now falling, tripping over. Men are being suffocated underneath. When to top it all, the second French wave, I've got them here, plough into the first. On into the English as they plough into them, pushing them so hard. They're thinking they're going to push them through the English. But in fact, what they're doing is they're pushing men over. You can see my own figures here are tripping. When this starts to happen, when the chaos that ensues here of men literally pushing their own comrades over, the men-at-arms of the English hacking them down, the Duke of Alençon, he can see the chaos. And he decides that if he can break free, if he can get up onto the hill where there are plenty of French soldiers, he could rally them. So he breaks away from this, rides a horse all the way back up the hill with some of his own guards, his own bodyguards, tries to rally men, but fails. He comes down the battlefield, he rejoins the fray. Meanwhile, the Duke of York, way over, has gone down. Apparently he suffocates. That's the sad thing, he was overweight. But then we have the Duke of Gloucester has been wounded, a knife has been thrust under his breastplate. The king goes to his aid because Henry V was in the front all of the time. The Duke of Alençon, facing the king, is knocked down to the ground. He can't get up. He raises his visor. He calls to the king. I am the Duke of Alençon. How's it going? Je suis Duc d'Alençon. How'd you like that? But unfortunately, before he can surrender, an English soldier, maddened by the battle, simply ploughs an axe straight through him. He's dead. But what happens next is incredible. The bowmen can see the chaos in the French army. They can see those men on the side are trying to get away from the arrows. Those men at the back are pushing on. The men at the front are being slaughtered. The men in the middle are collapsing under the weight of bodies. When the bowmen throw down their bows, pick up their personal weapons, and charge. But then, as they're charging into the French, they pick up the better class weapons that have been dropped by the cavalry. So they have polearms, they have lances. All of this is going on, and right in amidst the French army, apparently there were 18 French knights who had vowed to kill Henry V. There was rumour that he had a couple of doubles, but none of this has been proven. If there were 18 knights, they were killed for sure. But what happens now is the bowmen, seeing the chaos in the French army, the way the second French wave has ploughed in, the way the bodies are building up. Accounts of the day reckon that the bodies were stacked eventually so high that the English had to climb on top of them. In some places, the bodies were piled in groups of 3 right in front of the king at the height of a man. The bowmen, who have now come round the sides, have hit the French so hard, and all they're doing is bashing blokes over the head. As they fall down, they're dispatching them with their archers' picks. For 2 hours, the English will simply butcher the flower of France. Eventually, the battle peters out because there are no Frenchmen left standing who are actually fighting. They are all prisoners, or they are trapped under the mountain heaps of bodies. In the distance at the top of the hill, the French men-at-arms, forming the third wave, were looking on at the disastrous scene down below. They showed no signs of attacking, but just at this moment, there was a curious incident when the Duke of Brabant, the younger brother of the Duke of Burgundy, had arrived at the battle late. Didn't have his own armour, so he borrowed the armour of his chamberlain. Didn't have any colours, so he tore a banner from a trumpeter, cut a hole through it, put his head, draped it over him as a surcoat. He then charges down the battlefield with a few of his retainers, crying out, "Brabant, Brabant!" And as he gets in towards the English, he's simply knocked down and captured. But that's not the end of his story, not just yet. The episode with the Duke of Brabant was simply a diversion. What the English were busy doing now was sorting the living from the dead. The wounded who were too badly wounded, they were dispatched. They're worthless. It is now the business of ransom, making money. And they did this. They sorted out all of these prisoners for the best part of 2 hours. Thousands upon thousands of pounds was arranged in ransoms. Prisoners were exchanged. The whole business is going on. But meanwhile, the king is watching the French with his advisors, because scattered all over the battlefield are groups of French men-at-arms and French bowmen making their way back up towards the third line. Interestingly, the prisoners that were now being gathered hadn't been stripped of their armour, just their helmets. And around the battlefield were thousands upon thousands of weapons. So if you take the French third line, all of the scattered French men-at-arms and bowmen, together with the prisoners, they outnumbered the English. And don't forget, the English were absolutely exhausted. They were in a dangerous situation. Even though there was still animosity amongst the French soldiers high up on the ridge, that third wave, there were two knights who'd been inspired by the Duke of Brabant's brave charge, a brave young fellow. And they got together, 600 mounted men-at-arms and knights, and they formed up on the ridge, ready to charge. They were being watched by the king and the king's advisors. Now, as this happened, a couple of knights led an attack with peasants on the king's baggage train. The assault from the rear, where the king lost some precious jewels, a sword, a crown, that kind of thing. This alarmed the king, because he knew if they charged down the hill, all the prisoners had to do was stoop down and gather weapons off the ground. They weren't bound. This was a serious threat. So this is when the king calls out, "Kill the prisoners." Men were horrified. The English were horrified, not because they're going to have to kill the men. It's because how much the prisoners were actually worth. The king was furious at the reluctance of his men. He basically puts his foot down. He says, if you don't do it, you'll be punished. But then he orders an esquire and 200 bowmen to dispatch the prisoners. And dispatch them they do. They either stab them straight through the eye socket with their picks, or they slit their throats. It must have been the most horrendous sight. The screams that went up as these men went about their business. It's actually said that more Frenchmen were killed by the English archers doing the prisoners in than were killed in the overall battle. It stopped when it was realised that the French third line was not going to attack. The Duke of Orleans and Bourbon, they were spared. But the poor Duke of Brabant, when they saw him with a ragged surcoat, don't forget it was a trumpeter's flag, basically, they thought he was worth nothing. So they slit his throat. What a sad end. But now the French third wave, they stand off. They are not going to charge. As awful as it was, the slaughter of all those thousands of French prisoners, interestingly, the French chroniclers, they don't blame Henry V. They call it a painful necessity. They blame it on the French third line that were gathering to charge, which provoked Henry V into the action of slaughtering the prisoners. We will never know the true loss of life for the French at the Battle of Agincourt. Estimates range between 4,000 and 11,000. Modern French historians say 7,000. Modern English historians say 10,000. But after the slaughter of the prisoner, we do know that there was between 1,500 and 1,600 prisoners who survived. That will be for ransom. Some of the most notable was Marshal Boucicaut, the Duke of Orleans, the Duke of Bourbon, the Count of Richmond, the Count of Eu, and the Count of Vendôme. They would fetch a handsome ransom. When the list was compiled of French noblemen who were killed at Agincourt, the list actually went on for 10 pages. That's incredible. Estimates, the highest estimate for English casualties were 500, but more reliable sources say that actually it was 100, and most of them were wounded. But I have a list here of the most notable English who were killed We have the Duke of York. He probably suffocated. He was overweight and he was found underneath a pile of bodies. The Earl of Suffolk. He was the young Earl of Suffolk. His father had died of dysentery down at the Siege of Harfleur. Now, these two individuals, their bodies were boiled. Their bones then were sent home to England. Then we have Sir Richard Kiley, Thomas Fitzhenry, John D. Pennington, Walter Lord, and then probably one of the most famous, David ap Llywelyn ap Hywel, Davy Gam. Now, Davy Gam was knighted as he lay dying on the battlefield. He must have been a brave fellow to come to the attention of the king, who in that slaughter knelt down and knighted Davy. The battle only lasted for 3 hours. For the rest of the day, the English soldiers and some of their Welsh cousins there, they roamed the battlefield looking for booty, loot, and also extra prisoners and dispatching those who have been badly wounded. The king also walked the battlefield, but he didn't regard this as a personal victory. He regarded it as a victory for God. Now, he called upon the French principal herald, Mountjoy. That name is quite famous in history. And Mountjoy, he confirmed that it was an English victory. And the king asked him, what's the name of that castle that stands hard by? Oh, that's Agincourt. And the king says, well, a battle should take the name of the fortress that lies nearest to it. Henceforth, this battle, for the rest of time, will be known as the Battle of Agincourt. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video of ours. If you did, like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel further, have a look at our Patreon community. The link is in the description. And before I depart, I'd like to give a shout out to some of our Patreon members. Now, I've got it written down here, so here we go. Brian Lipins, Nicholas James and John Strawmeyer. Hey guys, thanks a million. Without your help, I wouldn't be able to make these models. Bye for now.